The alarm pierced through the relative quiet of the medical station at 0347 hours. Sarah Chen jolted awake in her narrow bunk, muscle memory already, pulling her boots on before her mind fully processed the urgent tone echoing through the makeshift barracks. Around her, other personnel stirred, but this particular sound meant only one thing: critical extraction needed. Lives hanging in the balance somewhere out in the darkness beyond their fortified perimeter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She stumbled toward the communications hub, her flight suit half-zipped, hair still disheveled from sleep. The radio operator, a young corpsman named Rodriguez, looked up with wide eyes as she approached. The static-filled transmission crackled through the speakers, painting a grim picture that made Sarah's stomach clench with familiar dread. Multiple casualties at grid reference 442 to 891. Heavy artillery strike on forward operating post. We've got 4 critical, 2 walking wounded. Hostile activity confirmed in the area. Repeat, hostile activity confirmed. The voice on the other end carried the controlled urgency of someone trying to maintain professionalism while watching people die. Sarah grabbed the headset, her voice steady despite the adrenaline already coursing through her veins. "This is Falcon-Seven. We copy your transmission. What's the LZ situation?" She knew the answer before it came, could hear it in the tense silence that followed her question. "LZ is hot. We're taking intermittent fire from the ridgeline. Cannot guarantee safe approach or departure." The admission came through gritted teeth, the frustration of a ground commander who understood the impossible position he was putting them in. Dr. Martinez appeared at her shoulder, already in full gear, his medical bag slung across his chest. Behind him, Torres and Williams moved with the efficient urgency of a crew who had done this dance too many times before. They didn't need to discuss the risks. Everyone understood what "LZ is hot" meant in practical terms. It meant flying into a shooting gallery with rotors spinning and wounded soldiers depending on their willingness to take that risk. How long can the wounded wait? Sarah asked, though she already knew this answer too. In her 3 years of emergency medical flights, she had learned to read between the lines of these transmissions. Critical meant minutes, not hours. Critical meant someone was bleeding out faster than field medics could patch them up. Negative on extended timeline. We've got one with penetrating abdominal trauma, another with severe extremity wounds. Clock is ticking fast on both. The ground medic's voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much death, who knew exactly how quickly a salvageable situation could become a body bag. Sarah looked at her crew, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. Torres was already running pre-flight checks in his head. She could tell by the way his eyes moved, calculating fuel loads and emergency procedures. Williams had that focused intensity he always got before dangerous missions, methodically checking his equipment with the precision of someone who understood that small details kept people alive. "We're wheels up in 8 minutes, Sarah announced. Her decision made, there had never really been a choice. The Hippocratic Oath didn't come with escape clauses for hostile fire or bad weather. People were dying, and they had the skills and equipment to save them. Everything else was just logistics. The sprint to the helicopter pad took them through the organized chaos of a forward medical base coming alive in response to mass casualties. Personnel moved with practiced efficiency, preparing receiving areas, checking blood supplies, setting up surgical suites. Everyone understood their role in the chain that stretched from battlefield to recovery room, and Sarah's crew represented the most dangerous link in that chain. The UH-60 Black Hawk sat waiting under harsh floodlights, its medical configuration clearly visible in the stark illumination. Stretcher mounts, advanced life support equipment, enough medical supplies to run a small emergency room. But underneath all that life-saving gear, It was still a military aircraft designed to survive in hostile environments. Armored where it mattered most, fast enough to get in and out before enemy forces could respond effectively. Torres was already in the cockpit running through startup procedures when Sarah climbed into the pilot's seat. The familiar weight of her helmet, the comfortable pressure of her flight harness, the subtle vibration of the aircraft systems coming online. All of it combined to create the mental space where her training took over from her fear. Tower, this is Falcon-Seven requesting immediate departure for casualty evacuation. She radioed, her voice calm and professional despite the urgency of their mission. Falcon-Seven, you are cleared for immediate departure. Wind is 080 at 12 knots, visibility unlimited. Be advised, latest intel shows increased hostile activity along your route. Recommend low-level approach to minimize exposure. Time. Sarah acknowledged the transmission while processing the tactical implications. Low-level meant staying below radar coverage, using terrain features to mask their approach. It also meant flying in the most dangerous envelope, where small arms fire and shoulder-launched missiles posed the greatest threat. But it was their best chance of reaching the wounded soldiers before it was too late. The helicopter lifted off smoothly, rising into the pre-dawn darkness with the steady thrum of rotor blades that had become the soundtrack to Sarah's professional life. Below them, the lights of the medical base quickly faded, replaced by the vast emptiness of disputed territory where every shadow could hide an enemy position. Dr. Martinez settled in among his medical equipment, methodically checking each piece of gear that might mean the difference between life and death for the soldiers they were racing to reach. IV fluids, blood products, advanced airway management tools, portable surgical supplies. His calm efficiency in the face of danger reminded Sarah why she trusted him completely in situations like this. ETA to target is 18 minutes at current speed, Torres reported through the intercom, his voice steady as he monitored their progress toward the coordinates they'd been given. Weather looks good, but I'm picking up radio chatter that suggests enemy movement in the area. Sarah adjusted their flight path slightly, following a valley that would keep them below the skyline while maintaining their heading toward the casualties. The night vision goggles painted the landscape in ghostly green detail, revealing terrain features that could provide cover or concealment for hostile forces. Every ridge line, every cluster of buildings, every patch of vegetation became a potential threat to be evaluated and avoided. The radio crackled with updates from the ground team, painting an increasingly urgent picture of the medical situation they were flying toward. The soldier with abdominal trauma was losing blood pressure despite aggressive fluid resuscitation. The extremity wounds were more severe than initially reported, with probable arterial involvement. Time was running out with each minute that passed during their flight. Falcon-Seven, be advised we're taking sporadic sniper fire from elevated positions to your north. Recommend approach from the south quadrant to minimize exposure. The ground commander's voice carried new tension, the kind that came from watching muzzle flashes in the darkness while trying to keep wounded soldiers alive. Sarah acknowledged the transmission while adjusting their approach angle, using her knowledge of the terrain to plot a route that would give them the best chance of reaching the landing zone without taking fire. The mathematics of survival in combat aviation came down to exposure time, approach angles, and the willingness to accept calculated risks in service of the mission. Behind her, Williams was coordinating with the ground team to ensure the landing zone was properly marked and secured. Red chemical lights to mark the safe approach corridor. Personnel positioned to provide covering fire during their time on the ground. Casualty evacuation priorities established based on medical urgency. The choreography of a combat medical evacuation required split-second timing and absolute trust between air and ground personnel. The target coordinates appeared on their navigation display as they closed the final miles to the casualties. Sarah could see the faint glow of the forward operating post on the horizon, a small cluster of lights in the vast darkness that represented hope for the wounded soldiers waiting for them. But between their current position and that destination lay unknown dangers that could turn their rescue mission into a tragedy. 2 minutes out, Torres announced, his voice carrying the tension that always preceded the most dangerous phase of their mission. Landing in a hostile area, loading casualties. Under fire, departing while potentially taking enemy fire. Everything they had trained for, everything their equipment was designed to handle, compressed into a few critical minutes that would determine whether they saved lives or became casualties themselves. Sarah began her final approach checklist, running through the procedures that would give them the best chance of survival during their time on the ground. Engine power settings optimized for quick departure. Defensive systems activated. Crew positions confirmed for maximum efficiency. During patient loading, the familiar ritual helped calm her mind while her hands prepared the aircraft for what lay ahead. The landing zone appeared in their night vision system, marked by the agreed-upon pattern of chemical lights that indicated a secure area. But Sarah had learned never to trust initial appearances in combat situations. Secure areas could become kill zones in seconds, and their large, noisy helicopter would be visible and vulnerable from the moment they touched down. Doctor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Martinez moved to the cabin door, his medical equipment ready for immediate deployment the moment they landed. His years of combat medicine had taught him to work efficiently under fire, to make rapid triage decisions that maximized the number of lives saved when time and resources were limited. Sarah trusted his judgment completely when it came to medical priorities, just as he trusted her judgment about flight safety and tactical considerations. Falcon-Seven, we have you in sight. LZ is marked and clear for approach. Standing by for immediate patient transfer. The ground team's radio transmission carried relief and urgency in equal measure. Relief that help was finally arriving. Urgency because every second counted for the wounded soldiers waiting for evacuation. Sarah began her final descent toward the landing zone, her eyes constantly scanning for threats while her hands maintained precise control of the aircraft. The rotor wash would kick up dust and debris, temporarily blinding everyone in the area while making them vulnerable to enemy fire. But there was no alternative. The wounded soldiers needed immediate medical attention that could only be provided at the main medical facility. The helicopter touched down with practiced precision, and immediately the organized chaos of a combat casualty evacuation began. Ground personnel rushed toward the aircraft, carrying stretchers and providing security, while Dr. Martinez moved out to begin his initial assessment of the wounded. Sarah kept the engines running, ready for immediate departure the moment all casualties were loaded and secured. The first casualty came aboard on a stretcher, the soldier's pale face and rapid breathing telling the story of severe blood loss more clearly than any medical report. Dr. Martinez went to work immediately, checking vital signs and adjusting 4 fluid rates while Williams helped secure the stretcher in the aircraft's medical bay. Training and experience took over, pushing aside the emotional impact of seeing another young soldier fighting for life. The second stretcher carried the soldier with extremity wounds, and Sarah could see even from her position in the cockpit that the injuries were severe. Tourniquets had controlled the bleeding, but the pale skin and weak pulse visible even in the dim cabin lighting suggested significant blood loss. Time was critical for both patients, and every minute they spent on the ground increased both the medical risk and the tactical risk to the entire mission. "That's 2 critical patients secure," Dr. Martinez reported through the intercom, his voice calm despite the intensity of the medical situation developing in the cabin behind Sarah. "I need to get these soldiers to surgery as quickly as possible. Blood pressure is dropping on the first patient, despite aggressive fluid replacement." Sarah was already beginning her takeoff procedure, when the distinctive crack of rifle fire echoed across the landing zone. The ground security team immediately returned fire while shouting directions to the helicopter crew. Muzzle flashes appeared on the ridge line to the north, confirming that enemy forces had identified their position and were attempting to prevent the medical evacuation. Taking fire from the north ridge, Torres reported with professional calm, his voice steady despite the bullets passing close enough to the aircraft to be clearly audible over the engine noise. "Ground team is engaging, but we need to get airborne now." The helicopter lifted off quickly, Sarah using every bit of her training to get them away from the hostile fire as rapidly as possible while maintaining control of the aircraft with critically wounded patients aboard. The ascent was steep and fast, trading altitude for distance from the enemy positions, while Dr. Martinez worked to stabilize his patients in the challenging environment of a climbing helicopter. Behind them, the muzzle flashes continued as the ground team provided covering fire for their departure. Sarah could see tracers in her peripheral vision, bright streaks of light that marked the path of bullets intended to bring down their aircraft. But they were climbing fast and moving away from the threat, using speed and distance to overcome the tactical disadvantage of being a large, noisy target in hostile territory. "Patients are stable for transport," Dr. Martinez reported once they had gained sufficient altitude to be clear of small arms fire. "But I need to warn the receiving facility that we're coming in with 2 urgent surgical cases. The abdominal trauma is going to need immediate intervention, and the extremity wounds are going to require vascular surgery to save the limb." Sarah acknowledged the medical report while plotting their most direct route back to the main medical facility. Time was now their most critical resource, with 2 soldiers whose lives depended on reaching surgical care within the narrow window that trauma medicine called the golden hour. Everything else became secondary to speed and efficiency. The flight back past intense concentration, with Dr. Martinez providing continuous medical care, while Sarah pushed the aircraft to its maximum safe speed. Torres monitored their route for additional threats, while Williams coordinated with the receiving medical facility to ensure everything would be ready for immediate surgery upon their arrival. The familiar lights of the medical base appeared ahead, and Sarah felt the relief that always came with completing a successful mission. 2 more soldiers would live to see another day. 2 more families would not receive the devastating phone call that meant their loved one was never coming home. It was why she had chosen this dangerous profession, why she was willing to risk her own life flying into hostile territory when wounded soldiers needed help. Even as they neared the relative safety of base, Sarah understood this mission was just one of many. Tomorrow would bring new casualties, fresh calls for emergency evacuation, and more chances to risk everything for the sake of saving lives. The war showed no signs of slowing, and as long as it raged on, wounded soldiers would continue to depend on those willing to fly straight into danger to bring them back. In the weeks that followed, missions came relentlessly, pushing Sarah to draw on every ounce of experience she had gained throughout her career. Each daybreak delivered another crisis, new coordinates scrawled in urgency, and fresh voices pleading over static-filled radios for help. The pressure never eased, but something within Sarah began to shift. What had once been standard medical evacuations became increasingly complex, stretching the limits of what was considered possible. The enemy had changed their tactics, adapting to the rhythm of rescue flights and laying ambushes along predictable routes. Sarah soon found herself navigating treacherous terrain-threading helicopters through mountain passes so narrow that inches, not feet, decided whether the blades would clear. She landed in spaces most would consider unlandable, her precision becoming the difference between life and death. Then came the morning that altered everything. Like so many others, it began in the pre-dawn calm with a high-priority transmission breaking the silence. But this time, the coordinates marked a point deep inside enemy-controlled territory, far beyond the range of ground forces and outside the safety net of friendly support. By any standard, the mission was a non-starter. And yet, the urgency in the voices over the radio made refusal unthinkable. "Falcon-Seven, we've got an off-the-chart situation," said Colonel Harrison, the regional commander, whose calm under pressure had always reassured Sarah. But now, tension edged his voice, signaling the severity of the crisis ahead. The mission briefing laid out a near-impossible scenario. A reconnaissance team had been ambushed deep behind enemy lines. 3 of their soldiers were critically wounded and pinned under heavy fire. Ground extraction was out of the question, and conventional air support couldn't reach them without risking further casualties. "The terrain is a nightmare," Harrison said gravely. "The landing zone is barely more than a narrow ledge on a mountainside. Wind shear makes it incredibly dangerous, and there's confirmed enemy activity all over the area." Sarah pored over aerial images and topographical data. The ledge was no more than a scratch on a rugged mountainside, hemmed in by sharp peaks. Wind currents would be chaotic and escape options limited. From a tactical standpoint, the area was a trap. Dr. Martinez, analyzing the casualty reports, didn't mince words. 2 with major chest wounds, 1 with severe burns over nearly half his body. They won't survive the day without surgery. We don't have the luxury of waiting. Torres, already knee-deep in flight maps, calculated possible routes. Direct path takes us over 3 known anti-aircraft sites. Going around through the mountains adds time and risk. Either option stretches us thin on fuel, time, and survivability. Williams, the crew chief, checked equipment and redundancies. "We'll be flying at the limit of what this aircraft can handle: altitude, weight, everything. We won't get second chances out there." The team spent hours dissecting every route, every risk, trying to solve a puzzle with no good pieces. Sarah sifted through her own past missions, hunting for ideas forged in fire and fear. Then inspiration struck. "There's one shot," she said, tracing a finger along the map. "If we come in through the eastern valley, we can use the terrain to hide our approach until the final moments. Wind will be more stable there, and we might slip past enemy spotters until it's too late for them to respond." It was a daring plan. Fly a narrow canyon just wider than their rotor span, then climb steeply toward the landing zone in a maneuver that left no room for error. A single mistake meant crashing into rock. Colonel Harrison studied the plan silently before nodding. "Forecast says visibility starts dropping this afternoon. If you're going to do this, it has to be in the next 4 hours." Sarah felt that familiar tension tightening in her chest, a bodily warning she had long since learned to interpret. Not ignore, but under the stress was something else: purpose. A focus that narrowed everything down to the only thing that mattered. 3 men were dying on a mountain, and she had the training and the will to go get them. The crew prepared with heightened urgency, checking every system, reviewing every contingency. They knew what was at stake. This was no ordinary rescue. It was a flight into the impossible. Every system was inspected and re-inspected. Emergency procedures were rehearsed until they became muscle memory. Inside the tight confines of the aircraft's cabin, medical equipment was arranged with surgical efficiency. Dr. Martinez added extra units of blood and critical surgical supplies, anticipating that he might need to perform emergency procedures mid-flight. Torres carefully calculated fuel loads, striking a delicate balance between reserve capacity and the strict weight limits imposed by high-altitude flying. The thinner air over the mountains would reduce lift and force engines to work harder, narrowing the margin between success and failure. Williams completed the most meticulous pre-flight check of his career. Every component, from rotor blades and engine performance indicators to hydraulic lines and electrical systems, was examined with the grim understanding that a single failure at altitude, deep in enemy territory, would almost certainly prove fatal. They lifted off at exactly 11:47 hours. The aircraft, burdened with gear and operating at the edge of its performance capabilities, immediately began to feel the effects of thermal turbulence. Their route would take them far beyond the reach of friendly artillery and well into hostile territory, where any malfunction or hit from enemy fire meant no backup, no rescue. The first leg of the journey unfolded as planned. The helicopter flew low and fast, hugging the terrain to avoid radar detection. Radio silence was absolute. Below, the land bore the scars of a brutal, unending conflict, ruined villages and burned-out military posts, testifying to the chaos and fluidity of the front lines. Dr. Martinez stayed busy in the cabin, checking equipment, rehearsing emergency procedures in his mind. Years of trauma care had taught him to expect the worst. Based on the reports, the injuries they were about to confront would stretch the limits of battlefield medicine. As the chopper neared the mountains, Sarah prepared for the most dangerous leg of the mission. The eastern valley loomed ahead, a tight corridor requiring surgical precision to navigate without slamming into the rock walls. The canyon narrowed and the margin for error disappeared. Gusty wind buffeted the aircraft, threatening to push it into the rock. Sarah stayed calm, her hands guiding the controls with practiced precision. Each movement had to be calculated, deliberate. Torres read out navigation updates over the roar of turbulence, his voice steady. "We're on course. Winds picking up faster than forecast. Climbing conditions are going to get worse." Exiting the canyon, they entered a wider valley that led to the final approach, but the danger didn't subside. Updated intel came. In over-the-coms, enemy forces had likely detected their movement, and anti-aircraft units were mobilizing. Falcon-Seven were picking up enemy chatter. "They're aware of helo movement in your sector," came the warning from command. "Advise you minimize time on target." Sarah responded with a terse acknowledgement, then pushed the aircraft to its limits, trading speed for increased fuel burn in a calculated gamble that they could get in and out before enemy units converged. The landing zone, carved into the sheer face of a mountain, finally came into view. It was exactly as shown in the photographs, though far more intimidating in person. A narrow ledge, barely the width of the aircraft, framed by sheer cliffs and hammered by unpredictable winds. Sarah initiated the most demanding landing of her career. The helicopter struggled in the thin air, engines screaming at full power, rotors straining for lift. Each adjustment to the controls had to be measured, or they risked blade stall or engine over torque. As they descended, the wounded became visible, motionless figures surrounded by medics, their condition critical. Chemical lights marked the landing area, but swirling winds scattered them, making visual cues unreliable. Dr. Martinez moved to the door, gear ready. One glance told him everything. Time was their enemy, and every second would count once they touched down. He prepared for rapid triage and intervention, knowing that the procedures ahead would be complex and improvised. With a final adjustment, Sarah set the aircraft down on the ledge, barely inches to spare on each side. Years of training and instinct had culminated in this moment. But the hardest part wasn't over. They had to load the patients in record time, all while staying ready to lift off at a moment's notice. Williams jumped into action before the rotors had even fully settled, guiding stretcher teams with practiced efficiency. The ledge was too tight for standard procedures. Creativity and speed were the only options. The first casualty was in worse shape than expected. The burns weren't just extensive, they had damaged his airway, putting his ability to breathe in immediate jeopardy. Dr. Martinez didn't hesitate. His role had now shifted from flight medic to frontline surgeon, and the clock was already ticking. Martinez immediately began emergency airway management, while Williams and the ground medics worked to transfer the soldier to their aircraft's advanced life support systems. Enemy fire began impacting the area as they loaded the second casualty. The distinctive crack of high-velocity rounds echoing off the surrounding rock walls. The ground security team returned fire while shouting warnings about muzzle flashes from multiple positions on adjacent peaks. Their tactical situation was rapidly becoming untenable, with enemy forces converging on their position from multiple directions. "We've got company on 3 sides," the ground team leader reported through gritted teeth, his voice nearly drowned out by the increasing volume of enemy fire. "You need to get airborne now, or we're all going to become casualties ourselves." Sarah maintained power settings for immediate takeoff, while her crew worked frantically to secure the third and most critically injured soldier. The chest trauma case was barely conscious, his breathing labored and his skin taking on the grayish pallor that indicated severe blood loss. Every second they remained on the ground increased both the medical risk to their patients and the tactical risk to their mission. The takeoff from the narrow ledge required even more precision than the landing, with Sarah lifting the heavily loaded aircraft straight up from the mountainside while enemy fire intensified around them. Tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit windows as she executed a climbing turn that would take them away from the most immediate threats while maintaining enough altitude to clear the surrounding peaks. Dr. Martinez was already deep in his medical protocols, working to stabilize 3 critically injured soldiers in the confined space of the helicopter cabin. 4 lines, oxygen administration, cardiac monitoring, pain management, all performed while the aircraft maneuvered violently to avoid enemy fire. His calm efficiency under these impossible conditions reminded Sarah why she trusted him completely. With the lives of their patients, the flight back to the main medical facility became a race against time on multiple levels. The soldiers needed surgical intervention within minutes rather than hours. Enemy forces were attempting to track their flight path and position additional threats along their route, and weather conditions were deteriorating as the predicted storm system moved into the area. But as Sarah piloted the aircraft through the increasingly challenging conditions, she realized that something fundamental had changed during this mission. The impossible had become routine, the extraordinary had become expected, and her crew had developed capabilities that exceeded anything she had previously thought possible. They were no longer just a medical evacuation team. They had become something entirely different, something that could succeed where conventional approaches failed completely. The recognition came without fanfare, delivered through official channels. That seemed inadequate for acknowledging what Sarah and her crew had accomplished in the mountains. A simple notification that their actions had been reviewed at the highest levels, that their willingness to attempt the impossible had not gone unnoticed by those who understood the true magnitude of their achievement. But recognition, Sarah discovered, brought complications she had never anticipated. Within days of their return from the mountain rescue, requests began arriving for Sarah's crew to handle missions that other teams had deemed too dangerous or technically impossible. The assumption seemed to be that having succeeded once in circumstances that should have resulted in failure, they had somehow transcended the normal limitations that governed combat aviation. The mathematics of risk and probability apparently no longer applied to Falcon-Seven. The first of these impossible assignments came disguised as a routine evacuation request, with coordinates that placed the casualties in an urban combat zone, where multiple factions were engaged in continuous fighting. Buildings reduced to rubble created a maze of obstacles that made normal helicopter operations impossible, while constant gunfire from unknown positions turned every street into a potential kill zone. Yet somehow, the mission planners had concluded that Sarah's crew could navigate these hazards and extract wounded civilians trapped in the chaos. Dr. Martinez reviewed the intelligence reports with growing disbelief, his medical training making him acutely aware of the additional challenges they would face treating casualties in such an environment. We're talking about landing in an active war zone with no clear lines of control, no identified safe areas, and no reliable communication with ground forces. This isn't medical evacuation anymore. It's urban warfare with a helicopter. Torres spread detailed maps of the city across their planning table, his navigator's eye immediately identifying the tactical nightmare they would face. The buildings channel wind in unpredictable patterns, creating turbulence that could slam us into structures without warning. Enemy positions have clear fields of fire over any possible approach route, and there's no room for evasive maneuvering once we're committed to landing. Williams examined photographs of the proposed landing zone with the practical perspective that had kept them alive through countless dangerous missions. We'd be setting down in an intersection surrounded by multi-story buildings, any one of which could hide anti-aircraft weapons or snipers. The tactical disadvantage is complete, and there's no backup plan if things go wrong. Sarah found herself staring at the mission parameters with a mixture of professional analysis and growing unease. The assignment pushed beyond the boundaries of calculated risk into territory that seemed designed to test whether her crew's previous success had been skill or merely luck. The casualties were real, their need for medical attention was urgent, but the probability of successfully completing the mission appeared negligible. "The wounded are civilians," came the voice of Colonel Harrison during the final briefing, his tone carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what he was asking them to attempt. Women and children caught in crossfire between government forces and insurgent groups. Intelligence suggests they've been trapped in a basement for 3 days without medical attention. Time is running out for all of them. The emotional weight of the mission added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Military casualties understood the risks of their profession and had chosen to accept those dangers in service of their mission. Civilians, trapped in urban warfare, had made no such choice. They're suffering the result of circumstances beyond their control or understanding. The moral imperative to attempt their rescue seemed to outweigh purely tactical considerations. Sarah spent hours studying satellite imagery and intelligence reports, looking for creative solutions to problems that appeared to have no acceptable answers. The urban environment eliminated most of the tactical advantages that had served them well in previous missions. Terrain masking was impossible when surrounded by buildings. High-speed approaches were blocked by structures and debris, and escape routes could be cut off by enemy forces moving through the urban maze. The mission preparation took on an intensity that exceeded even their previous high standards, with every crew member understanding that they would be operating in conditions that offered minimal chance of survival if anything went wrong. Equipment configurations were modified to account for the unique challenges of urban operations, with additional armor plating installed around critical flight systems and extra medical supplies, loaded to treat the civilian casualties they hoped to rescue. Dr. Martinez configured his medical bay for treating women and children, a task that required different equipment and procedures than the military trauma cases they normally handled. Pediatric medical supplies, specialized restraint systems for smaller patients, psychological trauma protocols for civilians who had never experienced the violence of warfare. The technical challenges were compounded by the emotional difficulty of treating innocent victims of circumstances beyond their control. The flight into the combat zone revealed the true extent of the devastation that urban warfare had inflicted on what had once been a thriving city. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins, their buildings reduced to skeletal frameworks that created a landscape of destruction visible from miles away. Smoke columns marked ongoing battles, while the absence of civilian traffic indicated areas too dangerous for normal human activity. Sarah piloted the aircraft through a route that took them between towering apartment buildings and around industrial complexes that could hide any number of threats. The confined nature of urban flight operations eliminated many of the defensive options available in open terrain, forcing them to rely on speed and unpredictability to avoid becoming easy targets for enemy forces positioned throughout the city. Radio transmissions from various military units painted a picture of fluid tactical situation with no clear boundaries between friendly and hostile forces. Government troops, insurgent fighters, and foreign mercenaries all operated in the same urban environment, their shifting alliances and conflicting objectives creating a situation where any group could pose a threat to the medical evacuation helicopter. Multiple factions are active in your target area, came the warning from their operations center. The intelligence officer's voice, carrying uncertainty about the reliability of his information. Latest reports show government forces engaging insurgent positions 3 blocks north of your LZ, but we've also got unconfirmed sightings of foreign fighters moving through the area. The landing zone appeared ahead as an intersection surrounded by damaged buildings, their broken windows and collapsed walls providing countless positions from which enemy forces could observe and engage their aircraft. Sarah began her approach, with the knowledge that they would be completely exposed during their time on the ground, with no cover available and multiple escape routes potentially blocked by hostile fire. The descent into the urban canyon created by surrounding buildings subjected the aircraft to turbulence, unlike anything Sarah had previously experienced. Wind patterns deflected off concrete surfaces and channeled between structures created sudden gusts that threatened to drive them into walls or power lines. She fought the controls with smooth, precise inputs while maintaining the steep approach angle necessary to clear the surrounding obstacles. Dr. Martinez moved to the cabin door as they approached the landing zone, his medical equipment ready for immediate deployment while his trained eye assessed the tactical situation developing around them. The intersection showed evidence of recent fighting, with debris scattered across the landing area and bullet holes visible in nearby walls. But there was no sign of the casualties they had come to evacuate. The helicopter touched down in the center of the intersection with Sarah maintaining full power for immediate takeoff, her eyes constantly scanning the surrounding buildings for signs of enemy activity. The urban environment amplified every sound, with the rotor noise echoing off concrete surfaces and creating acoustic signatures that would be audible for miles in any direction. Williams immediately moved toward the building where intelligence reports had placed the trapped civilians. His crew chief training focused on efficient casualty loading while maintaining security awareness in the hostile environment. But the building entrance was blocked by rubble, and there was no immediate indication of where the wounded might be located within the structure. Ground team, this is Falcon-Seven. We're on site but unable to locate casualties at designated coordinates, Sarah transmitted, her voice carrying growing concern about their exposed position in the middle of an active combat zone. The response came not from their operations center, but from a weak radio transmission that seemed to originate from somewhere within the damaged building. Helicopter, this is Dr. Kamensky with the International Medical Relief Organization. We're in the basement level with 6 casualties, but the main entrance is blocked. You'll need to access through the rear courtyard. Sarah processed this new information while maintaining her scan of the surrounding buildings, her tactical awareness heightened by the vulnerability of their position. Moving the aircraft to a different location would expose them to additional risks while extending their time in the danger zone, but leaving without the casualties was not an option given the urgent nature of their medical condition. The movement to the rear courtyard required precise maneuvering in the confined space between buildings, with rotor clearance measured in feet rather than the normal safety margins that governed helicopter operations. Sarah used collective and cyclic control inputs with surgical precision, maintaining position references off, building corners and architectural features while avoiding power lines and debris that could damage their aircraft. The rear courtyard proved to be even more challenging than the main intersection, with a landing area barely large enough for their aircraft and surrounded by walls that created a tactical trap if enemy forces moved to block their departure. But from this position, Dr. Martinez could see movement in the basement windows, confirming the presence of the casualties they had come to rescue. Dr. Kamensky emerged from the building carrying a small child whose obvious injuries immediately captured Dr. Martinez's attention. Burns covered much of the child's exposed skin, while her breathing indicated possible smoke inhalation that required immediate airway management. Behind the relief worker came additional casualties, each presenting medical challenges that would Test the limits of field treatment capabilities. We've got 2 adults with shrapnel wounds, 3 children with various trauma injuries, and 1 elderly woman with possible cardiac issues related to the stress of being trapped, Dr. Kaminsky reported as they began transferring patients to the helicopter. All of them have been without adequate food or water for 3 days, which complicates their medical status significantly. The loading process proved more complex than any military evacuation Sarah's crew had previously handled. Civilian casualties required different restraint systems and medical protocols, while their unfamiliarity with military aircraft and equipment created additional challenges for safe transport. Children cried in fear and pain while adults struggled to understand what was happening to them in a situation that exceeded their comprehension. Dr. Martinez worked with calm efficiency to stabilize each patient while accommodating the special requirements of treating civilians in a combat environment. Pain management for children required different dosages and medications, while the psychological trauma of their experience demanded approaches that went beyond purely medical treatment. His bedside manner adapted to provide reassurance and comfort. In addition to technical medical care, Williams coordinated the patient loading while maintaining security awareness. His attention divided between ensuring proper restraint systems and watching for threats that could emerge from the surrounding buildings. The confined courtyard eliminated most defensive options while creating acoustic conditions that would make any approaching enemy forces clearly audible long before they became visible. The sound of approaching gunfire began echoing off the courtyard walls as they secured the last casualty, indicating that their presence had been detected by hostile forces moving through the urban environment. Sarah immediately began her takeoff procedure while Dr. Martinez provided final checks of patient restraints and medical equipment connections. Hostile forces moving toward your position from multiple directions. Came the urgent transmission from overhead surveillance assets. Recommend immediate departure before your escape routes are compromised. The takeoff from the confined courtyard required even more precision than the landing, with Sarah lifting the heavily loaded aircraft straight up between the surrounding walls while enemy fire began impacting the area around them. Muzzle flashes appeared in building windows as various factions engaged each other while also directing fire toward the departing helicopter. The climb out of the urban environment subjected the aircraft to continuous enemy fire from multiple directions, with tracer rounds creating visible paths through the air around their position. Sarah used every defensive flying technique in her repertoire, varying altitude and direction randomly while maintaining enough speed to minimize their exposure time to ground-based threats. Dr. Martinez was already deep in his treatment protocols, working to stabilize 6 civilian casualties, whose injuries ranged from traumatic to life-threatening. The child with burns required immediate fluid resuscitation and airway monitoring, while the elderly woman showed signs of cardiac stress that could prove fatal without proper intervention. Each patient demanded individual attention while the aircraft maneuvered violently to avoid enemy fire. The flight back to the medical facility became another race against time, but with additional complications created by the civilian nature of their patients. Unlike military casualties who understood the tactical situation and could follow instructions during transport, the civilians required constant reassurance and monitoring to prevent panic that could interfere with their medical treatment. Dr. Kaminsky proved invaluable during the flight, using his experience with civilian medical relief to help manage patients who were struggling to cope with their injuries and the frightening environment of a military medical evacuation. His calm presence and ability to communicate in their native language helped reduce anxiety levels that could have complicated their medical condition. As they approached the main medical facility, Sarah realized that this mission had fundamentally changed something about their role in the ongoing conflict. They were no longer just military medical personnel treating soldiers injured in combat operations. They had become something broader, a lifeline for anyone caught in the machinery of warfare, regardless of their civilian or military status. The landing at the medical facility triggered a coordinated response that had been prepared specifically for civilian casualties, with pediatric specialists standing by to treat the injured children and interpreters available to help communicate with patients who spoke different languages. The integration of civilian medical protocols with military medical capabilities represented an evolution in their mission that Sarah had never anticipated. But even as the casualties were transferred to definitive care and their medical conditions stabilized, Sarah understood that the success of this mission would only generate additional requests for similar impossible assignments. The reputation they had earned for succeeding where conventional approaches failed had created expectations that seemed to grow more challenging with each completed mission. The debrief session revealed the full scope of what they had accomplished, with intelligence analysts confirming that multiple enemy factions had attempted to prevent their mission, while civilian relief organizations praised their willingness to risk military assets for humanitarian purposes. The intersection of military capabilities with humanitarian needs had created new possibilities for saving lives in circumstances that had previously been considered hopeless. But Sarah also recognized the unsustainable nature of continuously accepting missions that pushed beyond the normal boundaries of risk and probability. Each success raised the stakes for the next assignment, creating a cycle of escalating danger that could only end in failure. The question was no longer whether they could accomplish the impossible, but whether they could survive the expectations that their previous successes had created. The mission that would define Sarah's legacy arrived on a morning when weather conditions should have grounded all aircraft. Hurricane-force winds lashed the base while torrential rain reduced visibility to mere yards, creating conditions that made even ground operations hazardous. But somewhere beyond the storm, an entire medical convoy had been ambushed, leaving dozens of wounded personnel scattered across hostile territory with no possibility of ground evacuation. The emergency briefing took place in a bunker designed to withstand the worst weather the region could produce, with Colonel Harrison's voice barely audible over the sound of wind and rain battering the reinforced structure. The tactical situation defied every principle of safe helicopter operations. Yet the casualty reports made clear that without immediate intervention, the death toll would reach catastrophic levels. 17 vehicles destroyed or disabled, 43. Confirmed casualties with at least half requiring immediate surgical intervention, Harrison reported, his weathered face reflecting the weight of asking his people to attempt something that violated every safety protocol they had ever learned. The convoy was carrying medical supplies to forward operating bases when they hit a complex ambush designed to maximize casualties and prevent rescue operations. The weather data painted an equally grim picture, with sustained winds exceeding the maximum operating limits for their aircraft and gusts that could easily exceed structural design limits. Visibility fluctuated between 0 and 50 meters, making navigation impossible through conventional means while creating conditions where controlled flight into terrain became a statistical certainty rather than a remote possibility. Dr. Martinez studied the casualty distribution maps with the focused intensity of someone calculating odds that grew worse with each piece of information. The wounded are scattered across a 5-kilometer area, with enemy forces positioned to interdict any rescue attempts. We'd need multiple trips to extract everyone, and each landing increases the probability of aircraft loss or additional casualties among rescue personnel. Torres examined meteorological forecasts that offered no hope of improvement, his navigators training making him acutely aware of the impossibility of maintaining accurate position references in conditions that eliminated all visual landmarks. Storm system is expected to intensify over the next 6 hours before beginning to weaken. By the time conditions improve enough for normal flight operations, most of the critically wounded will be beyond medical help. Williams methodically reviewed equipment configurations and emergency procedures, his crew chief experience providing the practical perspective that often determined mission success or failure. We'd be operating beyond every performance parameter we've ever tested. Weight limits, power margins, fuel consumption, all of it becomes critical when there's no reserve capacity for unexpected conditions or emergency situations. Sarah found herself confronting a decision that would either save dozens of lives or result in the loss of her crew and aircraft, with no middle ground between complete success and catastrophic failure. The mathematical certainty of the weather. Data conflicted with the moral imperative of the medical emergency, creating a situation where conventional risk assessment became inadequate for making rational decisions. The planning session stretched through the morning as they examined approaches that seemed designed to prove the impossibility of their task. Every potential solution created new problems that amplified the existing challenges, while time constraints eliminated the luxury of waiting for better conditions or alternative rescue assets. The wounded were dying while they debated tactics, their survival dependent on decisions that pushed beyond the boundaries of acceptable risk. "There's one possibility that might work," Sarah finally announced, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what she was proposing. "If we use terrain-following navigation through the valley systems, we might be able to maintain some position reference despite the visibility. The mountains would provide wind protection during critical phases of flight, and we could use multiple smaller loads instead of trying to evacuate everyone in single trips. The approach she outlined would require flying at altitudes that eliminated safety margins while following terrain features that were invisible in current weather conditions. Navigation would depend entirely on instrument systems that had never been tested under such extreme conditions, while the multiple trips would compound their exposure to both weather hazards and enemy fire." Colonel Harrison studied the proposed flight plan with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades balancing mission requirements against acceptable risk levels. "The decision is yours, but I need you to understand that this goes beyond anything we've ever attempted. Weather conditions alone should ground all aircraft, and the tactical situation makes conventional rescue operations impossible." Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest that accompanied truly dangerous missions, but this time the sensation was amplified by the knowledge that failure would result not just in the loss of her crew, but in abandoning dozens of wounded personnel to die in conditions that made their suffering inexcusable. The weight of command had never felt heavier than in this moment of decision. The aircraft preparation took place in conditions that made normal maintenance operations nearly impossible, with ground crews working in driving rain and wind that threatened to knock personnel off their feet. Every system was checked multiple times while Sarah and her crew reviewed emergency procedures that might mean the difference between survival and catastrophe in the challenging conditions ahead. Dr. Martinez, loaded medical supplies configured for treating maximum casualty loads under field conditions. His experience with mass casualty events guiding equipment, selection for scenarios that would test every limit of combat medicine, blood products, surgical supplies, advanced life support equipment, all packed into configurations that would allow rapid deployment in hostile weather and tactical conditions. Torres calculated navigation waypoints using terrain features that would theoretically be detectable through instrument systems, his route planning accounting for wind drift and visibility limitations that made normal pilotage impossible. The mathematics of dead reckoning navigation became critical when visual references were eliminated by weather conditions that reduced the world to a gray void. Williams conducted pre-flight inspections that focused on systems critical for survival. In extreme weather, his attention concentrated on components that could fail under conditions that exceeded normal design parameters. Rotor systems, engine performance monitoring, flight control redundancy, all examined with the knowledge that mechanical failure in current conditions would prove instantly fatal. The takeoff into the storm tested every skill Sarah had developed throughout her aviation career, with the aircraft immediately subjected to turbulence that threatened to exceed structural limits before they had gained sufficient altitude for normal flight operations. Wind shear created sudden altitude changes that required constant attention to prevent loss of control, while visibility conditions eliminated all external references except for brief glimpses of terrain features. The flight toward the ambush. Sight became an exercise in controlled navigation through conditions that redefined the meaning of instrument flight. Sarah maintained aircraft control through turbulence that would have grounded commercial operations while following a route that existed more in theory than in visible reality. Every mile of progress required constant adjustments for wind drift and course corrections based on navigation systems that provided their only connection to known geographic references. Radio communications with the scattered convoy elements painted an increasingly desperate picture of medical situations that were deteriorating faster than originally estimated. Several casualties had succumbed to their injuries, while others were approaching the point where medical intervention would become futile. Time was running out for wounded personnel who had already endured hours of suffering in conditions that complicated their injuries. Falcon-Seven, this is Ground Team Alpha. We've got 8 critical casualties at our position, but we're taking intermittent fire from elevated positions. Weather is providing some concealment, but enemy forces are attempting to move closer under cover of the storm. The transmission carried the controlled desperation of someone watching people die while unable to provide adequate medical care. The first landing zone appeared through the storm as little more than a shadow in the gray void, its boundaries marked by the faint glow of chemical lights that were barely visible through the driving rain. Sarah began an approach that relied entirely on instrument references and the brief glimpses of terrain that emerged from the storm like ghosts before disappearing again into the meteorological chaos. The landing required precision that exceeded anything she had previously attempted, with the aircraft settling onto ground that was invisible until the final moments of approach. Wind gusts threatened to drive them into obstacles that existed beyond their visual range, while the tactical situation remained uncertain due to visibility conditions that affected enemy forces as much as friendly personnel. Dr. Martinez was moving toward casualties before the aircraft had fully settled, his medical training taking precedence over personal safety considerations in conditions that made normal triage procedures impossible. The wounded lay scattered across the landing area, their injuries complicated by exposure to weather conditions that had turned their medical emergency into a survival situation. The first group of casualties included soldiers with traumatic amputations, penetrating abdominal wounds, and burns that had been worsened by exposure to rain and wind. Each case presented medical challenges that were amplified by the impossibility of providing normal surgical care in field conditions that eliminated most treatment options. Dr. Martinez worked with calm efficiency to stabilize patients whose survival depended on reaching surgical facilities within minutes rather than hours. Loading operations proceeded under enemy fire that was largely ineffective due to visibility conditions that affected targeting accuracy. But the psychological impact of incoming rounds added stress to procedures that were already being performed under impossible conditions. Williams coordinated patient movement while maintaining security awareness that was limited by weather conditions that reduced threat detection capabilities to nearly zero. The takeoff with the first load of casualties subjected the heavily loaded aircraft to conditions that pushed beyond every performance limitation they had previously accepted. Sarah fought wind shear and turbulence that threatened to drive them into terrain, while maintaining sufficient power to climb out of the confined landing area with a payload that exceeded normal safety margins. The flight back to the medical facility became a race against time for patients whose medical conditions were deteriorating despite Dr. Martinez's continuous care. Weather conditions that had complicated the rescue operation now threatened the lives of casualties who needed immediate surgical intervention that could only be provided at facilities equipped for major trauma surgery. The second trip into the Storm revealed that enemy forces had adapted their tactics to account for the weather conditions, with increased activity around the remaining casualty sites that suggested coordinated attempts to prevent further rescue operations. Intelligence reports indicated that hostile forces were using the storm as cover to move additional personnel into positions that would threaten subsequent evacuation attempts. Each subsequent rescue mission pushed deeper into territory that was becoming increasingly dangerous as enemy forces concentrated their efforts on preventing the medical evacuations. The weather provided concealment for both friendly and hostile operations, creating tactical conditions where every landing became a gamble that could result in walking into an ambush that would be invisible until it was too late to escape. Dr. Martinez adapted his medical protocols to account for the multiple trips required to evacuate all casualties, triaging patients to ensure that the most critically wounded were evacuated first, while those with less severe injuries waited under conditions that complicated their medical status. His decisions carried the weight of determining who lived and who died based on medical assessments that had to account for factors beyond purely clinical considerations. By the fourth trip, Sarah's crew was operating on the edge of physical and mental exhaustion, with the stress of repeated flights in impossible conditions beginning to affect performance levels that were already being pushed to their absolute limits. Fuel consumption had exceeded normal planning parameters, while mechanical systems showed signs of stress from operating beyond design specifications. The final group of casualties included the convoy's medical officer, whose own injuries had prevented him from treating other wounded personnel, despite his proximity to medical supplies that could have saved lives. His presence among the casualties created an ironic situation where the person most qualified to provide medical care had become a patient requiring evacuation by others. The evacuation of the last casualties took place as enemy forces launched a coordinated assault on the landing zone that was timed to coincide with the helicopter's arrival. Muzzle flashes appeared through the storm as hostile forces engaged the aircraft during patient loading operations that could not be interrupted. Without abandoning wounded personnel to certain death, Sarah executed the most challenging takeoff of her career, lifting the aircraft away from enemy fire while maintaining control in weather conditions that should have made flight impossible. The storm that had complicated every aspect of their mission now provided the concealment that allowed them to escape from a tactical situation that had become untenable. The final flight back to the medical facility carried the weight of a mission that had succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation while demonstrating capabilities that redefined what was possible in combat medical evacuation. 43 casualties had been rescued from conditions that should have made survival impossible, proving that determination and skill could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. The landing at the medical facility triggered a coordinated response that had been prepared for mass casualty operations, with surgical teams standing by to provide immediate intervention for patients whose survival depended on care that could only be provided in fully equipped medical facilities. The integration of field rescue operations with definitive medical care represented the culmination of everything that combat medicine was designed to achieve. But as Sarah shut down the aircraft systems and began the post-flight procedures that marked the end of their mission, she understood that something fundamental had changed during those hours in the storm. The impossible had become routine, the extraordinary had become expected, and her crew had developed capabilities that exceeded anything she had previously imagined possible. The mission debrief revealed the full scope of what they had accomplished, with medical personnel confirming that 38 of the 43 rescued casualties would survive injuries that would have proved fatal without immediate evacuation. The success rate exceeded every statistical model for combat medical evacuation while proving that determination could overcome obstacles that seemed designed to prevent success. Colonel Harrison's final assessment captured the significance of what had been achieved while acknowledging the cost of continuously pushing beyond acceptable risk levels. What you accomplish today will be studied and remembered long after this conflict ends. You've redefined what's possible in combat, medical evacuation, and saved lives that would have been lost under any other circumstances. Sarah felt the weight of recognition that came with achieving something truly extraordinary, but also understood that such success created expectations that could never be sustained indefinitely. The mathematics of risk and probability would eventually assert themselves, regardless of skill levels or determination to succeed against impossible odds. The aftermath of the storm rescue marked the end of one chapter in Sarah's career while opening possibilities that extended far beyond conventional military medical operations. Her crew had proven that the boundaries between possible and impossible were more flexible than anyone had previously understood, creating opportunities to save lives in circumstances that had been considered hopeless. But Sarah also recognized that the greatest achievements often came with the highest personal costs, and that the willingness to attempt the impossible required accepting risks that could not be calculated or managed through normal means. The choice to continue pushing those boundaries would define not just her career, but her legacy as someone who refused to accept that any situation was truly hopeless. The storm had passed, but the impact of what had been accomplished during those impossible hours would resonate through every future mission. Sarah Chen had begun her career as just a paramedic, but she had become something entirely different. She had become proof that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when circumstances demanded nothing less than the impossible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.